Victoria's hands shook as she gripped the metal handles of the industrial trash bin, but not from the weight of the garbage or even the weight of the 6-month pregnancy that made bending over an exercise in controlled discomfort. She shook because 200 pairs of eyes were watching her husband Daniel demand this humiliation at Sterling Corporation's annual meeting because his mistress Jennifer was recording it on her phone with barely concealed glee, and because the choice before her was suddenly, devastatingly clear. For 3 years, she'd kept her identity as V. Marshall, the Trillionaire Board Chairwoman who'd built Sterling from her dorm room into a global powerhouse, separate from her identity as Mrs. Harrison, the quiet wife who attended company functions but never quite fit into Daniel's ambitious social circle. The separation had been intentional, a test of sorts to see if he'd married her for love or leverage. Now she had her answer, and it came in the form of trash. The board members who actually knew who she was sat frozen, uncertain whether to intervene or wait for her signal, while the others whispered about Daniel's audacity and Jennifer's shamelessness. In 7 minutes, Daniel's promotion to senior vice president was scheduled to be announced. The position he'd lobbied for relentlessly, the achievement he'd already celebrated with Jennifer in ways that had reached Victoria's ears through carefully maintained corporate intelligence networks. But Victoria was already composing the text that would cancel everything. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who should have valued you most? This story reveals the devastating cost of taking your partner for granted and the power of knowing your worth. You'll learn to recognize toxic relationship patterns, understand when silence becomes complicity, and discover why dignity matters more than revenge. What lessons resonated with you? What would you have done differently if you were Victoria? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story and want more powerful, entertaining tales with real-life lessons, hit that subscribe button. Your support means everything. The morning had started with promise, or at least the illusion of it. Victoria had chosen her navy maternity dress carefully, the one with subtle silver threading that caught light without demanding attention, the one that made her look professional enough for Sterling's annual meeting but maternal enough that people might remember she was 6 months pregnant and offer her a seat. She'd arrived at the 43rd floor executive boardroom 30 minutes early, partly because punctuality had been drilled into her during her years building Sterling from a college startup into a $15 billion empire, but mostly because she wanted to observe Daniel in his natural habitat, without him knowing she was watching. He hadn't noticed her slip in through the side entrance, hadn't seen her take a seat in the back row reserved for executive spouses and special guests, but she'd seen him. She'd watched him laugh too loudly at Regional Director Thompson's joke, watched him touch Jennifer's shoulder just a fraction longer than professional courtesy required, watched him check his phone and smile at whatever message waited there. The Daniel she'd married 3 years ago had been ambitious but kind, driven but considerate, hungry for success but not at the expense of his integrity. The man she watched now moved through the room like a shark, all calculated charm and barely concealed aggression, his eyes constantly measuring who mattered and who didn't. Jennifer sat in the 3rd row, her position as marketing director, giving her access to meetings she had no business attending based on her actual job performance. But Victoria had long since stopped questioning how Jennifer kept advancing despite consistently mediocre quarterly reviews. The answer sat in the text messages Victoria's private investigator had forwarded last month, the hotel receipts from the Los Angeles conference, the flowers charged to Daniel's corporate card that had never arrived at their home. Victoria had built an empire by gathering information before making decisions, and she'd gathered plenty about her husband's extracurricular activities, but information and action were different currencies, and she'd been waiting for the right moment to spend what she knew. Section 2. The meeting proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Quarterly earnings exceeded projections by 18%. The expansion into European markets showed promising preliminary numbers. The new software integration had reduced operational costs by $12 million annually. Victoria listened to executives present initiatives she'd approved in her identity as V. Marshall, the mysterious board chairwoman who communicated primarily through encrypted emails and video conferences with her camera disabled. The woman whose strategic vision had transformed Sterling but whose face remained unknown to most of the company. She'd established this separation intentionally when she'd met Daniel at a charity function 4 years ago, had introduced herself using only her middle name, Victoria, and had kept her role at Sterling completely separate from her personal life. It had been a test, she'd told herself, a way to know if someone could love her for herself rather than for her wealth or influence. Daniel had seemed perfect, ambitious enough to respect drive but not so desperate that he'd compromise his values for advancement. He'd proposed after 8 months, had supported her decision to work in consulting rather than push for details about her career, had seemed genuinely excited about building a life together rather than building a network. But people reveal themselves slowly in small compromises and incremental betrayals, in the distance between who they promise to be and who they actually become when tested. Victoria had watched Daniel's transformation with the analytical detachment she usually reserved for market analysis, cataloging each moment he chose advancement over integrity, each time he returned home later with thinner excuses, each evolution of his smile from genuine to calculated. She'd waited because she'd wanted to be wrong, because divorce while pregnant seemed like failure, because some part of her still remembered the man who'd held her hand during her father's funeral and promised to build something real together. The trash bin changed everything, but not because of what it represented. Victoria had endured dismissive comments before, had learned to navigate a world that often underestimated quiet women with unassuming demeanors. The trash bin mattered because of the audience, because Daniel chose this moment in front of 200 executives at Sterling's annual meeting to demonstrate exactly how little he valued her, to perform his contempt for Jennifer's amusement, to make absolutely certain Victoria understood her place in his hierarchy of importance. Victoria, his voice cut through the post-presentation chatter, pitched loud enough to ensure attention. The trash is overflowing, handle it. Not a request, not softened with could you or when you get a chance. A command delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who'd forgotten that marriage was supposed to be partnership rather than ownership. 200 faces turned toward her, some shocked, some uncomfortable, some carefully neutral in that way corporate politics demanded. Jennifer's phone was already recording, her smile sharp with victory. Victoria stood slowly, her hand steadying herself against the chair back, her other hand instinctively protecting the swell of her abdomen. The board members who knew her true identity, CFO Richardson, Legal Director Martinez, Strategy VP Okonkwo, sat frozen, their expressions cycling between horror and confusion, uncertain whether this was some test they'd failed to understand or a genuine crisis requiring intervention. She walked toward the trash bin with measured steps, each one a countdown to a decision she'd been avoiding for months, and lifted the metal handles with shaking hands. The room was silent as she walked to the trash bin, each step feeling like a mile. The weight of the moment pressed down on her chest, suffocating her in front of an audience that had never seen her this vulnerable. She'd been a force at Sterling, someone who commanded respect without asking for it, a woman who had built an empire in silence. And now she was being reduced to this, humiliation in front of people who had no idea what she was truly capable of. As she reached the bin, she paused. It would have been easy, so easy, to just comply, to take the trash, to return to her seat, to keep up the act for the sake of avoiding conflict. But she knew that if she did, she would lose more than just this moment. She would lose herself. Her fingers tightened around the metal handles of the trash bin, and she could feel the eyes of everyone on her, waiting for her to react. Some of them were probably expecting her to break down, to cry, to crumble under the weight of her husband's callousness. But that wasn't who Victoria was. She turned, her movements deliberate, and walked back toward the front of the room. The faces around her shifted from surprise to confusion to something else, something they wouldn't have expected from a woman who had always been a quiet observer. "Victoria," Daniel called again, his voice sharper now, a hint of frustration creeping in. "I said, handle it." But she didn't stop. She didn't even glance in his direction. She simply walked to the front of the room, her gaze never wavering. As she reached the podium, her pulse racing, she felt the moment stretch out like an eternity. The decision she had made was final. The trash bin had been her tipping point, but it wasn't just about the trash. It was about everything. The years of watching her husband's slow transformation, the countless compromises, the realization that he had never truly seen her, never truly understood who she was. Victoria placed the trash bin on the floor with a soft thud, her fingers still trembling. She stepped up to the microphone, her voice calm and composed as she addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her eyes sweeping over the board members who were still frozen in place, "I think we've all learned a very important lesson today, a lesson about respect and about power." The room was silent again, everyone waiting for her next words, unsure of where this would go. But Victoria knew. This was her moment. The metal handles felt cold against Victoria's palms, but the coldness spreading through her chest had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with clarity. She'd spent 3 years constructing elaborate justifications for Daniel's behavior, the pressure of corporate advancement, the stress of impending fatherhood, the natural evolution of romantic intensity into comfortable partnership. But those justifications disintegrated as she stood before 200 executives holding garbage like a servant dismissed with a wave. The boardroom had fallen into the particular silence that follows social violations, that suspended moment when everyone waits to see whether the victim will accept humiliation or challenge it. Victoria could feel the weight of expectations pressing against her from multiple directions. The executives who didn't know her identity expected her to comply or quietly exit, to preserve the social order Daniel had established. The board members who did know watched with barely concealed panic, uncertain whether her next move would be personal revenge or strategic corporate maneuvering, both of which could detonate spectacularly in this public forum. But Jennifer's phone camera forced the decision, because humiliation recorded became humiliation permanent, and Victoria had built sterling by understanding that perception shaped reality more powerfully than facts ever could. If this video circulated, and Jennifer's malicious grin suggested it absolutely would, Victoria's carefully maintained separation between her public and private identities would collapse not through her own revelation, but through someone else's mockery, which was intolerable on every level that mattered. She set the trash bin down carefully, the metallic sound echoing in the silence with surprising finality, and reached into her jacket pocket for her phone. Her fingers found the device with practiced ease despite their trembling, and she opened the encrypted messaging app she used for emergency board communications, the one connected directly to CEO Morrison's executive dashboard, to CFO Richardson's crisis management system, to the corporate governance protocols she'd established specifically for situations requiring immediate authority. The message took 7 seconds to compose. Cancel Harrison promotion. Terminate employment effective immediately. Full explanation to follow. VM. She hit send before doubt could interfere, before the accumulated weight of 3 years of marriage could convince her to choose private confrontation over public consequence. before the part of her that still remembered loving Daniel could suggest mercy he'd never shown her. The message delivered with a soft vibration, and she watched CFO Richardson's face across the room, register shock as his own phone buzzed with the alert, watched him glance at the message and then at her, watched understanding dawn with the force of revelation. "Actually," Victoria said, her voice cutting through the silence with surprising steadiness despite the chaos churning in her chest, "I think we need to address something before this meeting continues." Daniel's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to irritation, his smile tightening at the edges in that way that meant he was about to say something cutting, something designed to put her back in her place. But she'd already activated the electronic podium at the front of the room, already accessed the presentation system with her executive override codes, already pulled up the identity verification screen that would transform this humiliation into something far more devastating for everyone who'd underestimated her. "For those who don't know," she continued, her hand trembling slightly as she pressed the button that would display her credentials on the massive screen behind her, "my full legal name is Victoria Eleanor Marshall Harrison. I use my middle name. Socially, but professionally, I go by V. Marshall." The screen illuminated with her official Sterling Corporation Board Chairwoman identification, complete with the photograph she'd had taken 7 years ago when she'd incorporated the company in her Harvard dorm room with nothing but a laptop and an algorithm that would revolutionize data analytics. The photo showed her younger face, but the same quiet intensity, the same careful composure that masked ambition people consistently underestimated because she wore it without arrogance. The silence transformed from uncomfortable to electric, charged with the particular energy that precedes corporate catastrophe. She watched realization spread through the room in waves. First the board members who'd known confirming what others suspected, then the senior executives recognizing the signature they'd seen on countless memos, then the mid-level managers understanding why CFO Richardson had gone pale, and finally Daniel himself, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and then the kind of dawning horror that comes from recognizing you've made an irreversible mistake. "I founded Sterling Corporation 8 years ago," Victoria continued, her voice gaining strength from the truth she'd kept hidden too long. "I've served as board chairwoman since incorporation. I've approved every major strategic decision, every executive appointment, and yes, Daniel, I approved your promotion to senior vice president, which was scheduled to be announced in approximately 4 minutes. She paused, letting the past tense of "was scheduled" settle into the room's collective consciousness, watching Daniel's face drain of color as he processed the implications cascading toward him like dominoes toppling in slow motion. "However, circumstances have changed," she said, her hand moving to her abdomen in a gesture that was both protective and accusatory, a reminder that she stood here 6 months pregnant, after he'd demanded she empty trash in front of his mistress. "CFO Richardson, I believe you have an announcement to make regarding personnel changes." Richardson stood slowly, his expression carefully neutral, in that way senior executives perfected when delivering news they'd never imagined having to deliver. He cleared his throat twice, shuffled papers he didn't need, and finally met Daniel's eyes with something approximating pity. "Daniel Harrison's promotion to senior vice president has been canceled effective immediately. Furthermore, his employment with Sterling Corporation is terminated, also effective immediately. Security will escort him from the building following this meeting." Jennifer's phone clattered to the floor, the recording abruptly ending as her hands went slack with shock. The executives who'd laughed at Thompson's joke earlier now studied their shoes with sudden fascination, desperate to avoid association with the man who'd just committed career suicide by humiliating the woman who literally owned the company. Even Thompson himself had moved several feet away from Daniel, creating visible distance from the contamination of catastrophic judgment. But Victoria wasn't finished because humiliation demanded mirror and consequence demanded completeness, and she'd learned from building Sterling that half measures produced half results, which meant nothing changed and everything festered. She pulled up a second screen, this one showing Jennifer's performance reviews from the past 18 months, each one mediocre, each one somehow resulting in promotion or bonus, each one signed off by Daniel using authority he'd apparently assumed included the right to trade company resources for personal gratification. "Jennifer Carter," Victoria said, her voice still steady despite the satisfaction burning in her chest, like vindication finally allowed to breathe. "Your position as marketing director is also terminated, effective immediately. Your performance reviews suggest this decision should have been made months ago, but better late than never." The room had transcended silence into something approaching vacuum, everyone holding their breath as if exhaling might draw attention, might make them the next target of the reckoning unfolding with methodical precision. Victoria had built Sterling by understanding leverage, by recognizing that power deployed strategically accomplished more than power deployed emotionally, and she wielded both her authority and her dignity, like weapons forged from 3 years of quiet observation and careful documentation. Daniel finally found his voice, though it emerged hoarse and fractured. "Victoria, I never knew. We can talk about this privately. We could have talked about many things privately," Victoria interrupted, her hand still resting on her abdomen, still protecting the child who would grow up knowing their mother had chosen dignity over accommodation, consequence over excuses. "We could have talked about your affair with Jennifer. We could have talked about the hotel receipts, the text messages, the flowers you bought her with our money. We could have talked about whether you married me for love or leverage. But you chose this moment, this audience, this humiliation, so I'm choosing this response." She gathered her belongings with deliberate care, her movements slow but purposeful, each gesture communicating that she was leaving by choice rather than fleeing in distress, that she controlled this situation despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. The baby kicked against her ribs, either protesting the stress or offering solidarity, and she took it as the latter because she needed to believe something good would come from this wreckage. "The board will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m., she said, addressing the executives still frozen in their seats. "CFO Richardson will serve as acting CEO until we complete our search for someone who understands that leadership requires integrity, not just ambition. This meeting is adjourned." Victoria made it to her private office on the 45th floor before the trembling in her legs forced her to sit down, before the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation evaporated and left behind the raw ache of a marriage ending in the most public way imaginable. The office had been her sanctuary for 8 years, decorated in minimalist whites and soft grays that promoted the kind of clear-thinking corporate leadership required. But now the familiar space felt contaminated by everything she'd just destroyed downstairs. She'd destroyed her marriage, yes, but the marriage had been dying slowly for months, perhaps longer if she was honest with herself. What she'd actually destroyed was the illusion that Daniel had married her, rather than the opportunity she represented. The fantasy that love could survive contempt, the desperate hope that the man who'd promised partnership had simply lost his way rather than revealed his true character. Destroying illusions hurt worse than destroying reality because illusions required your own participation, your own willingness to ignore evidence in favor of the story you wanted to believe. Her phone vibrated with incoming messages, dozens of them, the corporate communication system lighting up with executives scrambling to process what they'd witnessed and position themselves appropriately in its aftermath. CFO Richardson had sent 3 messages in rapid succession. The first asking if she needed anything, the second requesting an emergency board meeting to discuss succession planning, the third simply stating, "I'm sorry you had to do that publicly, but for what it's worth, you handled it with more grace than he deserved." She appreciated Richardson's sentiment, but grace felt like the wrong word for what she'd done. Grace implied forgiveness or mercy, and she'd offered neither, had instead chosen surgical precision in dismantling everything Daniel had built on the foundation of her hidden identity. Precision wasn't grace, but it was clean, and clean cuts healed faster than ragged ones. Or at least, that's what she told herself as she stared at the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows that had cost more than most people's houses. The flashback hit without warning, pulling her back 14 months to the night Daniel had come home smelling of perfume that wasn't hers, and explained it away with a story about Jennifer spilling wine at a client dinner, about helping her clean up, about how Victoria shouldn't worry because Jennifer was not his type anyway. She'd believed him then, or convinced herself she did, because the alternative meant confronting truths she wasn't ready to face. She'd been 4 months pregnant, still adjusting to the reality of impending motherhood, still clinging to the vision of family they'd planned together over Chinese takeout and shared dreams. But that night had marked a shift, a hairline fracture in the foundation that would widen incrementally until today's earthquake shattered everything built upon it. She'd started paying attention differently after that, not with the trust of a wife, but with the analytical scrutiny she applied to potential business partners, cataloging inconsistencies and cross-referencing stories against evidence her private investigator provided monthly. The investigator had been her father's suggestion during one of their last conversations before the cancer took him, back when he'd seen something in Daniel that worried him but couldn't articulate beyond, "Just be careful, sweetheart. Ambitious men sometimes confuse wives with assets." Her father had built his own fortune through careful observation and pattern recognition, and he'd taught Victoria that people revealed themselves through accumulated small choices rather than dramatic moments. Daniel's small choices had accumulated into an undeniable pattern: the late nights that increased after her pregnancy started showing, the business trips that extended by just one more day, the way his eyes slid past her at company functions while lingering on Jennifer's carefully calculated smiles, the gradual erosion of intimacy until they were roommates who occasionally discussed logistics rather than partners who shared lives. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Victoria pressed her hand against the movement with a mixture of love and fear. She'd wanted this child desperately, had imagined raising them with a partner who valued family over ambition, who understood that legacy meant more than quarterly earnings and corner offices. Now she'd be raising them alone, or at least without Daniel, and the single motherhood she'd never planned suddenly stretched before her like uncharted territory, requiring navigation without maps. But she'd built Sterling without maps, had transformed a dorm room algorithm into a global empire through strategic thinking and calculated risk-taking, and if she could do that, she could certainly raise a child without a man who'd proven himself incapable of basic respect, let alone partnership. The thought brought surprising comfort, a sense that perhaps this ending was also a beginning, that removing Daniel from her life created space for something better, even if she couldn't yet imagine what that better thing might be. A knock on her door interrupted the spiral of thoughts threatening to pull her under. She straightened in her chair, wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling, and called out with a voice that sounded steadier than she felt. "Come in." CFO Richardson entered cautiously, his expression careful and concerned, carrying a leather portfolio she recognized as containing emergency board resolutions requiring her signature. He'd been with Sterling since the early days, had watched her build the company from scrappy startup to industry leader, had been one of the few people who knew her dual identity from the beginning and had never questioned her reasons for maintaining it. "I brought the termination paperwork," he said quietly, settling into the chair across from her desk with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd occupied it during countless strategy sessions. Legal needs your signature to make it official, and HR is asking about severance packages, though personally I think Daniel forfeited any claim to generosity when he handed you that trash bin. 3 hours after the meeting that had demolished her marriage, Victoria sat in the executive parking garage, watching Daniel load boxes into his car with the jerky, aggressive movements of someone whose anger had nowhere productive to go. Security had escorted him from the building as promised, but she'd instructed them to give him 30 minutes to collect personal items from his office, not out of generosity, but because she wanted to witness this final moment, wanted to see the physical manifestation of consequences he'd earned through accumulated contempt and calculated betrayal. He hadn't seen her yet, her black sedan parked 3 rows away, with tinted windows that turned her into an invisible observer, a reversal of the power dynamic that had defined their marriage. For 3 years, she'd been the one watched and judged, evaluated against standards she'd never agreed to, found wanting by a man who'd married an illusion and resented the reality. Now she watched him struggle with a box of personal effects that probably included the photo of them from their wedding day, back when his smile had seemed genuine and her hope had felt justified. The baby kicked, and she wondered what she'd tell this child about their father someday, how she'd explain that love wasn't always enough when respect was absent, that partnership required mutual value rather than hierarchical arrangement, that some people revealed themselves slowly and then all at once, in moments that crystallized everything you'd been trying not to see. She'd tell them the truth, she decided, age-appropriate versions that evolved as they grew, because children deserved honesty even when it hurt. Jennifer emerged from the building 20 minutes after Daniel, her own box noticeably smaller, her heels clicking against concrete with sharp staccato rhythm that suggested fury barely contained. She approached Daniel's car with the presumption of shared grievance, as if their terminations created alliance rather than mutual culpability, as if Victoria's revelation had victimized them equally rather than exposed them completely. Victoria couldn't hear their conversation through the closed windows, but she didn't need to. Body language told the story clearly enough. Jennifer's animated gesturing suggesting blame directed outward. Daniel's defensive posture indicating he'd already started rewriting history, to cast himself as victim rather than architect of his own destruction. Both of them engaged in the kind of revisionism that people performed when facing consequences they'd never imagined would actually arrive. The flashback came unbidden, pulling her back 6 years to the Harvard Business School entrepreneurship competition, where she'd first pitched Sterling's core algorithm, back when the company was just an idea that judges had called interesting but impractical. Despite her data proving otherwise, she'd won anyway, had taken their skepticism and transformed it into fuel for the obsessive work ethic that built Sterling into something that made those same judges request meetings they'd never receive. Building the company had taught her that other people's perceptions mattered less than her own execution, that proving herself required only her own effort and vision, that success was the ultimate response to doubt. But marriage had required different skills than entrepreneurship, had demanded vulnerability she'd struggled to offer, while maintaining the protective distance that kept her identity hidden, had created impossible paradoxes where honesty meant exposure, and exposure meant losing the test she'd constructed to measure Daniel's love. Perhaps she'd engineered her own heartbreak by creating conditions no relationship could survive, by testing him against standards she'd never communicated, by expecting him to love someone he'd never fully known. The thought brought unexpected guilt, uncomfortable questions about her own culpability in the marriage's failure, whether her deception had created the very contempt she'd punished him for displaying. But then she remembered the trash bin, the 200 witnesses, the calculated cruelty of choosing that moment for that humiliation, and the guilt evaporated because whatever her mistakes, they didn't justify public degradation, didn't excuse his affair with Jennifer, didn't somehow transform his choices into her responsibility. Daniel slammed his trunk with unnecessary force, the sound echoing through the parking garage like punctuation on a sentence neither of them had wanted to complete. He glanced toward the building one final time, his expression cycling through emotions too complex to categorize, before climbing into his car and starting the engine. Jennifer stood alone beside her own vehicle, watching him leave without her, apparently realizing that shared termination didn't automatically create shared future, that Daniel's loyalty extended only as far as convenience allowed. Victoria started her own car as Daniel's taillights disappeared toward the exit, not following him but preparing to leave herself, to drive to the penthouse apartment that would feel emptier now, despite being unchanged physically, to begin the process of untangling a shared life into separate existences connected only by the child growing inside her and the legal proceedings that would formalize their dissolution. But before leaving, she pulled out her phone and composed one final message, not to Daniel but to her executive assistant. Schedule board meeting for tomorrow, 9 a.m. Agenda items: permanent CEO search, maternity leave coverage, succession planning. Also schedule appointment with family law attorney for next week, and please arrange for movers to pack Daniel's belongings from the penthouse. Have everything sent to storage. Bill it to his severance package. The message sent with a soft whoosh, each agenda item a step toward the future she'd have to build alone, or at least without the partner she'd imagined building it beside. The family law attorney would handle the divorce with the same efficiency Sterling's legal team applied to corporate acquisitions, turning the end of her marriage into paperwork and asset division and custody arrangements that reduced love's failure into contractual terms. She drove home through evening traffic, the city lights blurring slightly through tears she finally allowed herself to shed in private, away from the corporate mask she'd maintained through the day's emotional demolition. The penthouse waited 43 floors above the street, all floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist furniture she'd chosen before Daniel had moved in, before she'd compromised her aesthetic to accommodate his preference for darker woods and heavier fabrics, before she'd started making small concessions that accumulated into larger losses of self. Tomorrow she'd reclaim that space, would donate his furniture to charity and restore the clean lines and open light she'd originally designed, would transform the apartment back into hers alone rather than theirs together. Tomorrow she'd meet with the board and begin the CEO search that would let her step back from daily operations as her pregnancy advanced, would plan for maternity leave and the work-life balance she'd neglected building Sterling at the expense of everything else. But tonight she sat in her car in the underground garage of her building, hands resting on her abdomen, feeling the baby move, and grieved not for Daniel specifically, but for the version of him she'd imagined existed, for the marriage she'd wanted rather than the one she'd actually had, for the family structure she'd planned that would now take different shape than anticipated. Grief felt appropriate even when consequences were just, because loss was loss, regardless of whether it was necessary, and she'd lost the future she'd envisioned, even if that future had been built on foundations too fragile to support the weight of reality. Her phone buzzed with responses to her message, her assistant confirming all arrangements, Richardson sending encouragement for the evening ahead, her attorney accepting the appointment and promising to make the divorce as painless as legally possible. The corporate machinery she'd built continued functioning despite her personal crisis, because good systems survived individual catastrophes, because she'd designed Sterling to operate whether she was present or not, because delegation and structure created resilience that individual effort alone could never achieve. She rode the elevator to the penthouse, each floor a countdown to the solitude waiting above, and keyed into the apartment that still smelled faintly of Daniel's cologne, still held evidence of their shared life in photos she'd need to remove, in furniture she'd need to replace, in memories she'd need to reconcile with the man he'd revealed himself to be today. The view from her living room window showed the city spreading endlessly toward horizons lit by millions of lives intersecting and diverging, connecting and separating, loving and losing in patterns as old as human existence. She'd survived this, she knew, because she'd survived worse in building Sterling from nothing, because resilience was her inheritance from a father who'd taught her that setbacks were information rather than failure, because the baby moving inside her demanded she build a life worth inheriting regardless of how much it hurt right now. She'd survive because she had no choice except surviving, because the alternative was unthinkable, because women had been picking up pieces and building new structures from rubble since the beginning of time. The thought brought unexpected strength, a sense of connection to every woman who'd ever faced betrayal and chosen dignity over bitterness, consequence over revenge, survival over surrender. She wasn't unique in her pain, but she had unique resources for addressing it. Financial security that meant she'd never be trapped by economics. Professional success that meant her identity extended beyond wife and soon-to-be mother. A support system she'd built through years of careful relationship cultivation that would help her navigate the transition ahead. Victoria stood at her window watching the city lights blur and sharpen as tears came and went. Her hand pressed against the glass that separated her from the 43-floor drop below and made herself a promise. She would not let Daniel's betrayal define her story, would not let this chapter become the entire narrative, would not sacrifice who she was becoming to who she'd been forced to be today. She'd made hard choices in that boardroom, had wielded power with precision rather than rage, had chosen consequence over accommodation, and while the aftermath hurt more than she'd anticipated, she wouldn't apologize for valuing herself enough to demand better. The baby kicked again, insistent and strong, and she took it as agreement, as the next generation reminding her that the future mattered more than the past, that what she built from these ruins would matter more than the structure that had collapsed. Tomorrow would bring board meetings and attorney consultations and the beginning of untangling 3 years of shared life. But tonight she stood in her reclaimed space and grieved what was lost, while simultaneously celebrating what remained. Her company, her strength, her child, her future unwritten and waiting to be shaped by choices she'd make with eyes finally devastatingly, completely open.